Magandang araw, Ginoong Abad at sa inyong lahat. Kami ang ikalawang grupo para sa signaturang ito. Kasama ko ngayon ang aking kapwa magagaling na mga mamamayag na sina Ginang Mel Cagastilo at Catherine Gadian. So simulan na natin. Ito ang mga elemento ng aming spider chart. Sa bersyon ni Ginoong Trinidad Pardo de Tavera, isang scholar, researcher at former Deputy Prime Minister ng Pilipinas. So let's start. Unang elemento, governance under General Izquierdo. Bago natin tignan ang kanyang pamamahala, balikan muna natin kung sino siya. Sino nga ba si Governor General Izquierdo? Si Rafael D. Izquierdo ay isang gobernador general mula 1871 hanggang 1873 sa panahon ng kolonyal na pamamahala ng Espanya. Under his leadership, he adopted an iron fist policy contrasting the previous approach of his predecessor, Governor General Latorre, in which the former Governor General showed leniency towards Filipinos. Under Governor General Izquierdo, he prohibited the establishments of schools for arts and trades, fearing it as a front for political subversion. Filipinos who supported Latorre were labeled as personas sospechas or suspects, creating a climate of fear and oppression among educated Filipinos. Sa makatuwid, kilala si Gobernador General Izquierdo sa mahigpit at mapaniil na pamamalakad, lalo na sa brutal na pagharap sa pag-aalsa sa Cavite noong 1872.
Good day everyone, my name is Catherine E. Gadjani and I'll be discussing the Cavite Mutiny and its immediate consequences. The Cavite Mutiny, which took place on January 20, 1872, was a significant turning point in Philippine history. The uprising occurred at the San Felipe Fort in Cavite, where Filipino soldiers who were deeply dissatisfied with their condition under Spanish colonial rule decided to revolt. The soldiers were upset due to various injustices, including unfair labor practices, heavy taxes, and the reduction of their wages. These issues created widespread discontent and resentment, eventually reaching a boiling point. During the mutiny, the Filipino soldiers launched an attack and managed to kill several Spanish officers, which clearly demonstrated the intensity of their frustration and desire for change. This act of rebellion was not just a call for better treatment, but also reflected the growing desire among Filipinos to challenge Spanish authority and seek independence. In response to the uprising, the Spanish colonial government acted swiftly and harshly to send a strong message to others who might have been inspired by the mutiny. The Spanish authorities decided to arrest and exile many prominent Filipino leaders and intellectuals to the Marianas Islands. This includes priests, teachers, and other influential figures who were thought to have inspired or supported the rebellion. By exiling these leaders, the Spanish government hoped to instill fear among the population and prevent further acts of resistance. However, this harsh response backfired. Instead of crushing the spirit of the Filipino people, it sparked even greater feelings of nationalism and a strong desire for independence. Many Filipinos began to see the Spanish authorities not just as unfair rulers but as oppressors who were willing to silence anyone who dared to speak against them. This event, along with the harsh treatment of Filipino leaders, became a rallying point that united many Filipinos in their struggle for freedom. The Cavite Mutiny, therefore, did not just highlight the injustice under Spanish rule, it has also helped ignite a stronger and more unified sense of Filipino nationalism that would eventually contribute to the broader movement for independence.
Sa ikatlong elemento, persecution of Filipino reformists and intellectuals. They called for changes such as better representation for Filipinos and reduced religious control in governance, which threatened Spanish colonial rule. Filipino reformists and intellectuals faced persecution due to their advocacy for reforms in the colonial system. Sa kabuuan ng mga Pilipinong reformista at intelektual na umihiling ng mga pagbabago tulad na mas makaturuang representasyon at pagbawas ng kontrol ng simbahan sa pamahalaan ay tinuring na banta sa kolonyal na pamahala ng Espanya. Dahil dito sila ay inusig at sinupil dahil sa kanilang mga panawagan para sa reforma.
Changes in the colonial government system. The Cavite Mutiny of 1872 was a pivotal event that led to increased repression and strengthened the power of Spanish residents and friars in the Philippines. Though the mutiny itself was small and quickly suppressed, it had long-lasting effects on colonial governance. First, reinforced Spanish colonial authority. In response to the mutiny, Spanish authorities tightened their control over the Philippines, increasing military presence and implementing martial law. This repression helped solidify the power of loyal Spanish residents who acted as intermediaries for the colonial government, particularly in urban areas like Manila. Second, strengthened role of the friars. The Catholic Church, led by Spanish friars, was further empowered after the mutiny. The friars, already influential in governance and in education, supported Spanish repression and worked to maintain social order. They also played a role in suppressing reformist ideas and maintaining the status quo, reinforcing their grip on local communities. Third, suppression of reformists. The mutiny provided Spanish authorities with an excuse to target Filipino reformists and intellectuals who were advocating for civil rights and political reforms. Reform leaders like Jose Rizal faced greater surveillance, imprisonment, and exile. Fourth, increased division between Spaniards and Filipinos. The mutiny, the mutiny deepened the divide between Spanish residents, including the military and friars, and Filipinos, especially the educated elite. The Spanish reinforced their reliance on loyal groups to maintain order, which further alienated the Filipino population. Fifth, impact on Filipino clergy. The execution of three Filipino priests, which are the Gomburza, after the mutiny led to heightened tensions between Filipino secular clergy and Spanish friars, with the latter reasserting their authority. For that, the Cavite Mutiny allowed the Spanish to tighten their control over the Philippines, consolidating the power of Spanish military, civil officials, and friars while repressing growing Filipino calls for reform and independence. This event set the stage for the rise of Filipino nationalism in the coming decade. Madrid's reform promises, particularly Moret's proposal of 1870, raised Filipino hopes for a fairer government but were ultimately unfulfilled, fueling Filipino discontent. First, the Moret Decree on 1870. This decree promised the reforms such as Filipino representation in the Spanish Cortes and greater civil rights. It was seen as a step toward fairer governance. Second, unfulfilled promises. Despite the initial optimism, the reforms were never fully implemented. There was no Filipino representation in the Cortes, and civil rights protection were largely ignored. The Spanish friars and colonial officials resisted these changes. Third, growing discontent. The failure to deliver on these promises led to disillusionment among Filipinos, particularly reformists. Many felt betrayed by the Spanish government, which continued its repressive rule. Fourth, impact on Filipino nationalism. The unmet promises contributed to the rise of Filipino nationalism, shifting reformist leaders toward revolutionary ideas and laying the groundwork for the Philippine Revolution. In short, the, the unfulfilled promises of reform under the Moret Decree deepened Filipino dissatisfaction with Spanish rule and played a crucial role in the growth of the independence movement.
Kalimang elemento, rule of religious orders in colonial governance. Religious orders, especially in the friars, held significant power in the Philippines, reinforcing Spanish sovereignty. The friars' influence in government policies and civil affairs was a major obstacle for Filipinos desiring progress and autonomy. Sa kabuuan, ang malakas na impluensya ng mga orden ng relihiyon, particularly ng mga praile sa pamalaang kolonyal ay nagsilbing pangunahing sandigan ng kapangyarihan ng Espanya sa Pilipinas. Gayunpaman, ito rin ang naging malaking hadlang sa harangin ng mga Pilipino para sa kaunlaran at kalayaan.
Impact on Filipino-Spanish relations. In the beginning, some Filipinos felt a connection with the Spanish government, hoping that they could work together to bring about reforms that would improve the lives of Filipino people. Many Filipinos, especially the educated class, believed that with the right changes, a more just and fair society could be achieved under Spanish rule. However, this hopeful relationship between the Filipinos and the Spanish authorities began to deteriorate as the Spanish government became more oppressive. The harsh response to the uprising like the Cavite Mutiny, along the exile of Filipino leaders and the silencing of voices calling for reform, deeply hurt the trust that some Filipinos once had in the Spanish rulers. Instead of addressing the legitimate concerns of the people, the Spanish government chose to suppress them through fear and punishment. This action only worsened the situation and created a growing sense of resentment among Filipinos. The more the authorities tried to tighten their control, the more it fueled the desire for change. This increasing oppression was a turning point in Filipino-Spanish relations. Instead of encouraging loyalty, it sparked a strong sense of Filipino nationalism. The harsh action of Spanish government made it clear to many Filipinos that they could not rely on the colonial rulers for the reforms they wanted. This growing discontent and desire for independence eventually laid the groundwork for a more organized and widespread movement to achieve freedom from Spanish rule.
Izquierdo's repressive policies, including arrest, forced labor, and harsh punitive measures, cultivated widespread resentment among Filipinos and fueled growing resistance against Spanish rule. First, arrest and punitive measures. Under Izquierdo, many Filipinos, including reformists and intellectuals, were unjustly arrested and punished for suspected disloyalty or rebellion. These actions created an atmosphere of fear and injustice. Second, forced labor. The enforcement of polo y servicios or forced labor contributed to widespread suffering, particularly in rural areas. Filipinos were forced to work on public projects without pay, worsening their already harsh conditions. Third, cultivation of ill feeling. These repressive measures, combined with the unjust treatment of key figures like the Gomburza priest, deepened resentment towards the Spanish authorities. The resulting ill feeling pushed many Filipinos toward resistance. Fourth, growing resistance. The cumulative effect of these policies led to the rise of Filipino nationalist movements. The harsh treatment under Izquierdo became a major catalyst for the Philippine Revolution, as Filipinos increasingly sought the independence from Spanish colonial rule. In summary, Izquierdo's policies of repression led to arrest, forced labor, and punitive measures that cultivated widespread anger and contributed to a growing resistance movement against Spanish colonial rule. Governor Izquierdo's repressive policies and the growth of resistance. Governor General Rafael de Izquierdo's repressive rule on 1871 to 1873 significantly fueled Filipino resentment towards Spanish colonial rule. His harsh measures, including unfounded accusations of insurrection, targeted Filipino advocating reforms and led to widespread fear and distrust. First, unfounded accusations of insurrection. Izquierdo used the Cavite Mutiny as an excuse to accuse Filipino intellectuals and leaders of conspiracy, even without solid evidence. The execution of the Conversa priest in 1872, who were wrongly accused of plotting rebellion, became a symbol of Spanish injustice. Second, brutal crackdowns. Izquierdo heavily relied on the military force to suppress perceived threats, using forced labor and violent reprisals against anyone seen as challenging Spanish rule. His repression targeted both suspected rebels and reformists. Third, increased surveillance and censorship. The Spanish authorities under Izquierdo cracked down on Filipino reformists, censoring the press and placing reform leaders like Jose Rizal under scrutiny. Fourth, impact on Filipino nationalism. Izquierdo's brutal repression radicalized the Filipino reform movement. The execution of Gamburza, in particular, galvanized nationalist sentiments and inspired figures like Andres Bonifacio and Emilio Aguinaldo, leading to the rise of the Philippine Revolution in 1896. Izquierdo's repressive measures, including baseless accusations of insurrection, deepened Filipino resentment and laid the groundwork for the eventual revolutionary movement that sought to end Spanish colonial rule.